Stillgestanden, Männer. Tonight I am just so stupidly amused. Right, with something I've picked up and something I've just recently learned that has just got me so tickled, right? It's just pathetic, but here we go. Now, if you were following recently, I've already covered authors like Sven Hassel and Leo Kessler, the war pulps, supposedly telling, World War stories of usually fairly dubious merit, supposedly from the German viewpoint. And recently I covered one of the sort of lesser pretenders, the mysterious Gunther Lutz, who was never, as successful as the Hassel types in that field. But, it got me wondering. There were a lot of kind of minor contenders chasing that war nerd sort of buck back in the late 70s, or probably before the late 70s even, but from my own kind of exposure to pulpy sort of books, certainly early 80s, up until a point in the 80s anyway, when it became rather unfashionable at a certain point. But at the time I picked these things up, 1980 onwards, I was still at school, this genre was still, it still represented money to publishers such as Corgi. Anyway, in my doubt, I try to do a little reading around to establish who some other authors in that field might be, and there's one I hadn't read before. Star Books, I think this is about 1983-ish, this one. Wolf Kruger. Now, who was Wolf Kruger? I mean, that name sounds... Well, the authors in that field always had this, the publishing houses wanted you to think that the author was German, and I suppose the suggestion being that, well, you would extrapolate that they must have been a genuine veteran. I mean, Wolf Kruger, it sounds like a German in a film. It sounds like the sort of character, sort of cold blue eyes that, have stared over the icy steppes during the various Eastern campaigns in which he served hard time on some unit, possibly with a rather dubious track record of conduct in that most savage of theatres. Wolf Kruger. Who could he have been? Well, Wolf Kruger. If you're not already in on this, you're gonna freak. Wolf Kruger was Sean Hudson. Can you believe that? Yes, this, I think, looking at the timeline of Sean's publications, these almost seem to predate the horrors. I think the earliest in his war series was dated as 1981. Now, I remember Hudson as the sort of newcomer in horror. I think I was still at school there, 83. I think I read Spawn in 1983. It would have been just around the time I left school and really should have been reading. Well, I was reading better books than that, but I was still reading pulp, so there you go. But yeah, this was complete news to me. Sean Hudson had made a few entries into the field of war pulps under this fake name Wolf Kruger. And this was, I guess, a few books into the series Kessler's Raid, subtitled Into the Jaws of a Death Trap, and it looks to me like they may have used, probably without his permission or cooperation, it looks to me like Hardy Kruger might have been the inspiration for the cover model. That certainly looks like him to me anyway. But anyway, so what's this one all about? Christmas 1941. The jumped up little corporal's dream of conquering Russia is buried in the bitter winter snows. Men frozen where they... it's just you just think this is going to be Blitzfreeze, which, though it takes place within... I did cover that book a few years ago, within that sort of fateful campaign, the first year of Germany campaigning in Russia, 1941. That winter took the wind out of their sails, really, so it's set within that context. However, well, let's get into characters first. The main protagonist of this, Kessler. That name's already familiar if you know about this genre. His name is Kessler. Rolf Kessler. I'm sorry, Rolf Kessler. Rolf fucking Kessler. I mean, it's like either Hudson was really knowingly taking the piss there, or he just couldn't be arsed and just came up with some placeholder name. Yeah, Rolf Kessler, yeah, that'll do. And just ran with it. I don't know, but so that's a good start. Rolf Kessler is the usual kind of hard-bitten NCO familiar type to anyone who's ever read any of this sort of thing. No belief in the German cause, but he's fighting to get his men through familiar territory, really. So yeah, there they are on the frosty Russian front in 1941. Now there's the men in his platoon, there's the kind of Nazi fanboy guy there that will be a familiar archetype. There's the greedy bastard, forget names now, but there's the kind of slightly gimmicky foreign volunteer, in this case a big Russian guy. I guess he's a Cossack of some or other ethnic group that is kind of estranged from the cause of Stalin. He likes to operate with a big sword, like a big Cossack type of blade kind of thing, so he deals with most disagreements using that. There's the kind of standard blood and guts in the snow Russian front bit for the first part of the book. There's this bit, another cliche of this sort of fiction. There's the supposition that on the Russian steppe you were in danger of being eaten by wolves. Now, I think I probably swallowed that as a kid, and sort of thinking about it now, I'm not so sure how. I mean, I wouldn't like to put it to the test, but I'm not quite sure how usual it is that a wolf would attack a person. And I did try and do a little bit of reading on this. I found an article referring to an incident in the First World War in the Eastern Theatre. I couldn't find anything referring to it in the Second World War. You may know if you know otherwise, obviously in the comments please, but anyway, the idea that a German soldier on the steppe was equally in danger from savage wolves as from Russian infantry. Anyway, there's a wolf attack in this guy gets torn apart by a bloody wolf. It is quite graphic. Being Hudson, the violence is pretty graphic. Anyway, it steps out, it doesn't pay a lot of attention to historical credibility, shall we say. Once the usual kind of Ostfront fiction stuff is dispensed with, and once we've got past the wolf attack, we get into the meaty bit of the plot, which is Kessler. He's going to have what's this raid he's going to have? Well, the raid turns out to be that a prominent German general, appraised of Kessler's reputation as always comes through kind of hard-assed NCO with a crack. It's Sledgehammer Platoon. In this, they've got to have a gimmicky name, haven't they? Sledgehammer, right? So Kessler and Sledgehammer are required. You'd think in the winter of 1941 German generals would have had other things to worry about, but no. This one is so fixed on sort of jockeying for favour with the jumped up little Austrian corporal that he's figured that behind the Russian lines there's, I forget if it's a commissar or somebody within this mysterious castle somewhere behind Moscow. There's this very rare, I think it's a bust of Frederick the Great. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if this general could organise for that to be lifted out of the hands of the Russians and delivered to Berlin with a pretty ribbon on it or something? That would ensure his promotion to Field Marshal, whatever it is he's after. So of course Kessler's section are pulled into this job. So a specialist Luftwaffe pilot in an adapted long-range Heikel or a Junkers, I forget, but he gets the task of landing way beyond Moscow in this kind of rather sparsely populated area of the Soviet Union, and they have to prize this bit of antique artwork out of this castle, which turns out to be protected by a heavy-duty squadron of Cossacks. Do they achieve their aim? Of course they do, but not without this kind of white-knuckle ride sort of chase. The Cossacks bearing down on them with their sabres rattling as the Germans run for the plain. But yeah, you know, of course they pull it off. You know, you knew they were going to, right? So they get this thing back to Berlin, but you know, highly aggrieved at the men and the trouble that it's cost him. Spoiler alert: Kessler double crosses this general and sort of smashes the sculpture up and tells him to fuck off, kind of thing. And, you know, there's nothing he could do about it because he has dirt on him. And also, I think the guy's Hudson and violence. Of course, someone, the Cossack guy beheads the guy's SS lackey in his private office or library at the whatever kind of headquarters he's ensconced in. You know, the key characters live to fight another day. Now, it's like I say, it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny as any sort of accurate or believable account of the German experience in World War II. It's very gimmicky, it's fairly predictable, but you know, got to say that's if you're a true pulp writer, if your job is to churn one out every couple of weeks, that's what you do. You don't get bogged down in. I mean, you know, Hudson throws in panthers and tigers in the winter of 1941. He doesn't care. You know, hardware that won't exist for the next year or 18 months. Just throw it in, you know, because your readership will have a mental age of about 13 anyway. So, and I don't exclude myself from that. But if you're gonna do all out pulp, you just throw everything else to the wind and churn it out. And it, you know, in its favour, it is, I suppose, quite an efficient. You know, it kept me reading. You know, I had no illusions that it was any kind of quality thing, but it did keep me glued from beginning to end. You know, so. As easy it is to lampoon Hudson for his excesses, he's always been skilled at that, I believe. And, you know, fair play to him with the genre hopping. I mean, I believe he dabbled in westerns as well. It's kind of, well, he claims to have been sacked from every job he'd ever had up to that point. I think he was living around Hertfordshire somewhere, I think he's from. So if he was going to make a go at writing, he was going to make a go at writing. Churn them out. Don't sweat the kind of historical detail or the, you know, the authenticity too much. Load up on the Nescafe and churn them out throughout the course of a week, and he did that. But he didn't end up making that much of a name for himself in the field of war fiction, but he did establish himself as a writer successfully within a couple of years of starting on these war pulps. So fair play to him, but I just can't get over. Did you know this? Why didn't you tell me before? I just can't get over that Hudson had diversified into this particular field. So certainly a curiosity item anyway. I'm not necessarily going to go out and buy the whole series. They're quite pricey actually. They're quite rare now, I suppose. I mean, I don't think that he's got the big print runs that his horror titles did, but there you go. So if you do want a break from Sven Hassel's, you could do worse, I suppose. Anyway, thank you for sticking with me through that. More soon.